שלום, ערב טוב, אנחנו רוצים להתחיל. Okay, good evening to all. I'm happy to open the 10th anniversary of the Levtzion Center for Islamic Studies. I just realized, in fact, that I'm now the chairman of this panel. It wasn't clear to me at the beginning, but nevertheless, I'm doing my best, and I'm very happy to invite our first speaker to bless the audience. Professor Gidon Shelach, Gidi, he's the head of the Asian and African Institute. Please.
Thank you, Eli. I will be very brief because I know we have more interesting things to hear today. Just want to, as the head of the Institute, to congratulate first of all the Levtzion Center and Liat and the other people who are involved. Eli, we all know that the center is working with a very limited resources, but is able to do a lot of activities and actually, I think, to exemplify what is or should be the role of academia, both very in-depth studies and bring highest lecture or of the highest academic level, but also reach various people, not only within the university but outside, and I think this is a great achievement. We are sometimes, especially in recent years, quite pessimistic about academia, and even in recent days hearing about firing of people from the humanities and so on. And even the institute that I represent is not what it used to be. But I think there is a place for optimism. In things that are like the Levtzion Center, like we do in the other part of Asia with the Freeberg Center, and hopefully in the near future will again rise and become a more important factor in this faculty and in the university in general. I think already the three departments that are part of the institute, Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, the Arabic department, and the Asian Studies are among the largest departments in the humanities, and there is a lot of interest in those topics, and I think there is place for optimism even when there are not such good news is on the radio. So again, I'm congratulating you for all those activities, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting evening.
Thank you very much. I would like to use the opportunity and to say that I think that celebrating the 10th anniversary is a great achievement. In particular, taking into account the limited resources that the Institute had from day one. And therefore, I think that the predecessor, Professor Meir Hatina, and currently Dr. Liat Kozma, I mean, they are doing wonderful work by using these limited resources, and what we are witnessing is so much activities that really go beyond these limited resources. And I can't help thinking to myself, you know, because we had many difficulties along the years. We are trying to enlist the support of outside elements and also the university itself in order to mobilize the resources. And I always had the thought that if the Levtzion Center would have been for Jewish studies and not Islamic studies, we would have been in a different situation in terms of mobilizing the financial resources. And you know what? I mean, if that my assumption is correct, then this is very sad news for all of us. And we are very much hopeful that in the future we'll be able to extract some good money from possible donors, and most probably Jewish donors. Okay, Amnon, this is your turn, Professor Amnon Cohen, Professor Emeritus at our department.
Good evening. You already know my name. And I was asked to speak a bit about another name, Professor Nehemia Levtzion, whose name is written on the board here, and whose activity we still bear very much in mind. Actually, when I was coming up to campus with my wife, I told her, funny thing of being an emeritus, that is one of the old guards, so to speak. And not only that I don't know the faces, not only that I don't know the faces of the young students, I wouldn't dare say male students, I hardly recognize the faces of the grown-ups, of the adults, of the retired around here. Because the university is moving forward very dynamically, of course, and rightly so, that's the way it should be. But the outcome, one of the outcomes is there is a tendency of forgetting or abandoning, putting aside things that have been quite important in the life of the very same university quite some time ago. And Nehemia Levtzion was one of these. Actually, I said Nehemia, in the right way to pronounce his name in English would be Nehemiah. And I still recall when I was once asked to go, when I went to the States to try to fundraise, apropos opening remarks, to fundraise a little bit of funds for this institute, I met with Harvey Kruger, also an old name, a young person but an old name, and a very important one of the donors, big donors of the Hebrew University, trying to convince him to help us out in setting up this institute. And he would always, he said, yes, of course, he knew Nehemiah. And I said, what's this Nehemiah? He was Nehemia. He said, no, the right way to pronounce. And he was right, of course. There's Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and Nehemiah. This is also right. But the way we used to call him, and I refer to it in the Hebrew way of pronouncing the name, is Nehemia. So I was asked to speak about Nehemia for several minutes. And I took some notes, and I hope I'll be able to cover the whole ground. I'll speak of Nehemia in three contexts. One, Nehemia the scholar. The other one, Nehemia the public servant. And the third, last but not least, Nehemia the person. First, Nehemia the scholar. Nehemia was more or less same age group of mine. He was a bit older than myself, not really. Some few months, I think. And when he finished, we studied together, and when he had his MA, he finished his MA thesis and work, he was sent by the Hebrew U to learn, to study, to get hold of a totally new topic and totally new field. At the time, I'm not sure what it was already called the Institute of Asian and African Studies. I'll come back to it. But they, definitely, even if the term African Studies was used already, the thought was there. And the idea was that we shouldn't, at the Hebrew University, teach only about the Middle East, Islam, Arabs, Turks, Persians, but there's a much wider context of Islam, which covers quite vast areas in this world, and Africa is not the smallest of them all. So he was sent to London, to the University of London, to SOA, School of Oriental and African Studies, and where he did his dissertation between 62 and 65 on Ghana, on Islam in Volta, which is in Western Africa. He came back in '65 with a PhD from the University of Volta. There had been some teaching of some African topics at the Hebrew University beforehand, but when he came back, a whole trend started, a new direction of teaching and studying the history of Africa, not just Islam in Africa, but Africa altogether. And actually, he became, in the early '70s, head of the Department of African Studies, and under him, quite a number of young people at the time, by now some of them are retired already, studied, he nurtured them, and they became a young faculty at this university, and actually the other universities of Tel Aviv, of Israel as well. Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheba. So the Department of African Studies became quite active, but Nehemia didn't leave, didn't abandon his earlier love to Islam altogether. And while he was working, writing, publishing extensively on African topics, he still kept very close ties with Department of Islamic Culture at the time, and which became eventually Department of Near Eastern Islamic Studies at the university. He had quite a number of PhD students covering Islam throughout the world, I should say. Not only Islam in the Middle East, he did a research on, he actually coached a dissertation on Malaya, which is now called Malaysia, but basically it was British Malaya, which was done by, at the time, a retired diplomat still with us, Moshe Gedar, who then later on published it, and who it was a new opening towards the Far East Islam, Far Eastern Islam. He, of course, did a lot on conversion to Islam, published some conversion to Islam, he did a lot on Sufism and so on, so he kept his contacts and he kept his eyesight, so to speak, on Islam in our world, so to speak. But the most important part of his activity became African studies at the time. This was true in the 60s, in the 1970s, 80s, and then in the 1990s, things started to disintegrate. I'm here to praise Nehemia, so it wasn't his fault, of course, but we shouldn't forget facts. Quite a number of the top faculty of that particular department went to other fields, so to speak. One of them became a politician, another one became one way or another, also close to politics and so on. And all of a sudden, even though there were quite a number of students, there were 30, 40 students at the time, there was hardly anyone to teach. Nehemia himself also, as I'll come back to it in a second, was asked to cover other grounds. So the university decided, the department actually disintegrated altogether. And those who started doing her dissertation with him, or with his former students, at the time his colleagues, went on doing it, and nowadays they fill important positions in other universities. But our university, the Hebrew University, decided to discontinue the department altogether. And from the early 90s onwards, there is no African studies at the Hebrew University, period. Now, the fact that we have an Institute of Asian and African Studies is an important fact, and definitely a lot of cause. But as you may have noticed, when he spoke about the department, he said we have a department of Middle Eastern Studies, we have a department of Arabic Studies, and we have a third one of, I don't know what, Asian Studies. He mentioned the word African Studies altogether. Shame on us. Please pass it on to the university authorities. So that is number 1 point, Nehemia the scholar. The second short paragraph that I talk on about will be his work as public servant. after having established the department and been so active within it, he took upon himself a few other endeavors. He didn't stop doing research and writing, but from the 1980s onwards, actually from the late mid-1970s, he became active in a few other fields, mostly in Jerusalem, but also throughout Israel. Now, in 87 to 92, he was the president of the Open University, which is in Tel Aviv, of course. It's all over the country, but it's located in Tel Aviv. This was in the late 80s and early 90s. Earlier than that, in the early 80s, he became head of the Ben-Zvi Institute for the study of Jewish communities in the East. He wasn't just a director of that institute. In 85, he brought this institute, the entire Yad Ben-Zvi, the honor of having been decided, having been granted Israeli Prize, in 1985, and I think I still recall that Nehemia spoke in the name of the whole group of the honoree at the time. So this was Open University then, Machon Ben-Zvi, and then of course Van Leer Institute, which he took upon himself, Van Leer Institute, which was which needed a director to try and fill in missing links there. Nehemia took it upon himself, and for what was it, 5 good years, for 5 years, was director, executive director of Van Leer. But his highest mark of public activity was his position as head of the Planning and Budgetary Committee within the Committee of Higher Education in Israel. This is actually the academic and administrative body which is overseeing the whole activities of within Israel, of all Israeli universities. And by overseeing, I mean also financing them, helping them to survive. You know, universities survive. Something about positions being closed down. Universities are not being closed down because it's too risky in any context, but it's hard for them to survive. So they enjoy slightly, not so slight, but meaningful support of the government, which doesn't come directly, but through that Committee of Higher Education. Nehemia served as the head of that committee for 2 terms, between 1997 and 2003. 3 years and then another 3 years. And he was extremely active, dynamic, and fruitful in his work there. His 2 main foci of attention were first trying to broaden the basis of university higher education, not only to those chosen ones who can afford studying in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, Haifa, but to a wider audience, to the periphery. And he was very instrumental in setting up the college system in Israel, Mechlalot, in Safed, close to the Shibas, the Shiba. Institutes that are now very active and quite famous and doing a lot of important work. This was one focus of his activity as head of the Budgeting and Planning Committee. And the second one had to do with the traditional big universities, our for once, in Tel Aviv, and the other one in Haifa and so on. And his main focus was trying to stabilize them, not just as an institution of higher learning, that is where we teach students, tens of thousands of students, but to stabilize them as institutions of research university. And this was the second thing. But one shouldn't forget a few other activities here in Jerusalem or all throughout Israel. He was quite active in trying to promote or help out Arab education, or education within the Arab sector in Israel altogether, particularly in Jerusalem. I still recall Sarah Nusseibah, the president, don't think that he's anymore the president. He was the president of Al-Quds University, speaking highly of his the attempts of Nehemia to bring him into the loop and try and help him out when the university, Al-Quds University was just being built. And Nehemia was extremely involved in it. And another part of his peripheral activity was something which I am not sure is that well known to even people who are here. I don't know about members of the family, but people who are here, and that is another sector of education which was missing very much, and still is missing in Israel. That is higher education for Haredim. Now, Haredim, that is Orthodox Jews, extremely Orthodox Jews, and Nehemia was quite involved with the daughter of the then Gordon, not Gatz anymore, Rabbi Yosef, and his daughter Adina Bar Shalom was extremely active in trying to set up, and eventually did set up a college for higher education for Haredim girls and boys separately, of course, but still. So these are acts which weren't just by hazard, but actually that could easily be seen as part of a system where trying to make education, higher education, available to the periphery, either geographical periphery, social periphery, or any other periphery, national, if you wish. And the third and last point I would like to highlight is Nehemia, the colleague and the friend. I'll try and be brief on it. He was a very warm person, first of all. Very warm person, always ready to help out, and not only his students, of course, but also his colleagues and even institutions where he was involved in. He had an innovative mind which always looked for new venues, new directions, new activities to be brought in, to be introduced, to be followed up later on, new grounds to work on, both academically and in a wider sense, which we don't have time to get into right now. And of course, the third point, important, he was very much a family man. A family man, sorry, he was a family man. He, even though quite active, as you may have gathered by now, in a few fields where he was always involved in, he kept very close steps on his growing up family, the young members of the family, who are still young as I see, but who were even younger at the time. I can still think of one example, for instance, and she will forgive me if I mention it. The person who is right now running the Hadassah Hospital here next to us was younger at the time, and she volunteered as a young volunteer to Israeli Mogen David, right? And eventually it helped out to clarify the direction of where her efforts would lead her, and the same may be said about other members, young members of his family. But the last point, of course, I would like to highlight is Tirza. I said family man, and I said the whole thing is about Nehemiah, but the most important part of his activity was his wife Tirza. Not as we always say, there's someone behind every general, and it's usually his wife, not his adjutant. But she was extremely active in her own capacity as a high school teacher, but even in the context, and that's in the context of this institute that we're speaking of. When Nehemia unfortunately passed away prematurely, Tirza came up with the idea of setting up an institute. It wasn't that simple. It still isn't that simple as we understood. But it was much harder at the time to think that anything of that kind would emerge. This is a university where there is an Institute for Asian African Studies and departments of Islam, and there's a German institute. There's a lot of activity going on in the context of Islam one way or another. But there was nothing which was supposed to focus on Islam in its various denominations, in its various forms. And she was extremely active in convincing, should I say, us, the university, and it was set up. not 10 years ago, I think 11 years ago. It's the 10th anniversary lecture, but this means that it's 11 years.
We are in history, not mathematics.
That's okay. History of ideas will have anyhow. It's a 10th anniversary lecture, 11 years. But it took a few good months and a lot of efforts to convince the university authorities to set it up. There's still some room for more activity and more support. That's another question. But at the time, Tirza was very much involved in setting it up, and we are all thankful to her for what she did. Wider context of this particular context, and we see the context is still live, kicking, and extremely active academically. So looking back, 10, 11 years, the institute is now run by Leat with her assistance, and I may point out that someone who's seen the university from various angles, it's extremely energetic, extremely dynamic, and I would dare say extremely dynamic and successful, and I congratulate you and the whole staff who helped you out, Sasha and others. And to sum up, there are 2 points that I would like to mention, just points. A, as I said before, if we decide to leave the name of Asian and African Studies as is, the university should think again of setting up again a Department of African Studies. Otherwise, they should change the name. And so this is either way, either change the name or bring in or rebuild the department, which Nehemia was extremely instrumental in setting up and bringing to reality. This is one point to the university authorities. And the second one, the same university authorities, the fact of the matter is that the different people who've been running the institute, and I guess we are even nowadays, have been struggling quite hard, not so much in bringing bright academics from abroad or in doing research, this goes without saying, but in getting more support fundraising. And I would like to point out that it's, the message should reach once again the university authorities. These are the general term, their names and telephone numbers to these people, of course. So to encourage them to help out, not just haphazardly, just like this, but to find a more solid financial solution basis to this important institute. Thank you very much.